Hey, I'm Bill, and today I'm going to go over the basics on how to deploy PC over IP workstations with Azure Active Directory domain services instead of the more traditional domain controller deployments. So I'll be going over the basics on what the Azure Active Directory domain services is, the overall deployment architecture, and I'll also be running through a deployment step by step to show all the steps involved. So without further ado, let's get started. So here I'll just give a brief background overview on Azure Active Directory Domain Services, which I'll just abbreviate as AADDS from here on out. So the AADDS is a Microsoft offering that provides fully managed domain services and features such as domain join, group policy, LDAP protocol that you would expect out of a traditional domain controller on site. So the advantage of these services is that they're fully managed by Azure, so there's no need to configure or update these domain controllers. The AADDS also provides automatic syncing with user credentials and groups in the Azure AD tenant and supports features like backup and encryption, which are automatically included. Behind the scenes, the AADDS actually deploys two identical domain controllers. So there's two created for redundancy purposes to be able to maximize availability. So this is the architecture of the deployment that I'll be showing today. This is a single connected deployments. Other deployments are also available, but I want to focus on the AADDS itself. So I'll be going over this one since it's relatively simple. The architecture itself isn't too different from existing single connected deployments, with the main difference being that it connects to an AADDS instead of a domain controller. So the AADDS also provides DNS servers which can be configured, and other than that, everything else should be relatively familiar with the PC over IP clients sending HTTPS requests to the connector and then establishing a PC over IP connection with the workstation. Another point of difference is that the CAS manager is configured to use the Azure Key Vault and MongoDB for data and secret storage rather than the default HashiCorp Key Vault, but that's not too relevant to the AADDS itself and not a requirement or anything to get it working. All the configuration for those is happening behind the scenes. So with the deployment process itself, I won't go over in too much detail here since I'll be giving a demonstration later. But the basics is that you just ensure you have the requirements fulfilled. You fill out the terraform.tf vars file for the AADDS deployment. You wait for that to finish. Then you do the same for the workstation deployment. So one strange thing that you do have to watch out for is that in order to perform a workstation deployment, you'll need an Azure AD service account. So this will just be any account in the Azure AD tenant. And to actually have a valid account and have it working, you actually need to reset the password on that account after the AADDS has been finished provisioning. So for more reasons on why that is, you can follow the Microsoft link here, but the gist of it is that it's a requirement for password syncing and hashing purposes. So unfortunately there's no way around it, and it's a bit of a hassle, but hopefully the AADDS isn't something that you'll be deploying and destroying too much anyway. So I'll stop here with this part and get into the actual deployment itself on Azure. So I'm here at the AADDS documentation, which you can find in the GitHub repo with all the other deployments. This just lists the steps and requirements for deploying the AADDS. So I'll start off with the requirements. Access to a subscription on Azure, I have that already. So you need an Azure account which has both the global administrator and billing administrator roles. So in order to check that, you go to the Azure portal, you go to Azure Active Directory, go to users, click on the user that you'll be using for the deployment and check assign roles. So make sure you have these first two, third one shouldn't be necessary. You also need Azure Cloud Shell access. I forgot, you also need the contributor role in the subscription, so to check that you just go subscription. My role is owner, which is higher than contributor, so as long as your role is at least contributor, everything should be fine. So Azure Cloud Shell access, this I'll just be using the browser-based Azure Cloud Shell. It's possible to run locally, it's also possible to run Terraform completely locally without the Azure Cloud Shell, but the browser Azure Cloud Shell already has everything set up, so you won't really need to do any extra configuration or anything. So I'm just trying to keep things simple. So if you check, I have nothing in this directory right now. To set up the deployment, I'll go to Azure Deployments, the GitHub repo with all the deployments in it. I'll copy this link and I'll type git clone that repo. So after this is done, you should have an Azure Deployments folder, and this should have an AADDS deployment ready to go. So this is the file, the folder with the AADDS deployment and all the relevant files. So the file you're interested in changing is the terraform.tfvars file. So I'll move the sample file to the actual file so that it actually works and Terraform can pick it up. And I'll start the process of filling out the TFVars file. So you'll first need the subscription ID, which is actually just right over here. You'll need the resource group name and the virtual network name. So these can be anything. You can set them to anything. You just need to keep them consistent for the workstation deployments. So I'll actually change the resource group name to this, just to indicate that it's mine. This is a domain name, so this has to be a domain that you own. By default, Microsoft actually assigns you this domain for each tenant, so I'll be using this one. The location, this can be anything you like. I'm just choosing US West 2, and this is the password of the PFX certificate. So this will just be the password of the SSL certificate that's configured to use to enable LDATS communication on the AADDS. And that's about it. So it's relatively simple. This is all set up and ready to go. So I just need to save. I need Terraform init. I'll just Terraform apply auto approve. And now it looks like the deployment's going. So this can actually take 30 to 40 minutes, and it will take another 30 to 40 minutes for Azure to finish provisioning this. So I'll just leave this running and stop the video here, and I'll be back when this finishes. Alright, I'm back, and it looks like the AADDS finished provisioning successfully. So this is the provision resource group that I'm in right now. And just to make sure everything's done, you want to head to the actual AADDS resource, which will be named after the domain name, and click on it. And you just want to make sure there's no message at the top saying that this resource is still being provisioned. As long as that isn't there, it should be ready to go. So this should be ready to deploy workstations on now. So as before, this is the workstations folder. It's freshly pulled from GitHub, and just like with the AADDS, we just need to fill out the Terraform variables file. So just like before, I'll move the sample variables file to the actual variables file, and then start editing it. Alright, let's make this thing a bit bigger. So at the top, these are just the variables that describe the workstations. So this will be a Linux VM that is in the graphics VM. Similarly, this will be a Windows VM. The count means how many workstations we want to deploy. So in this deployment, there's one Linux VM and one Windows VM, and I set it to 0 for the graphics VMs. So there's no graphics VMs in this deployment. Going down to the actual required variables, this variable will be the username of the Azure Active Directory service account, or just really any account that you can use for the purpose of this deployment. There's no really special requirements. So if you go to the Azure Active Directory and click on users, it can be any one of these accounts that isn't a guest. You can even use the account you're currently logged into. I'm actually going to log into this account that I made for the purposes of this deployment. So you just want to enter the username in here. The virtual network name and resource group name were specified from the AADDS deployment, and you just want to keep those variables consistent across deployments. So the virtual network name is still left as the default, as you can see here. So it's just AADDS TerraVNet, don't need to change that. I did actually change the resource group name to have a BY prefix in front of it, so I've added that into the variable here. The domain name will just be what you set as a domain name. It will also just be the name of the AADDS resource here. The admin password will be the password to the account that you entered for the username. So it will be the password of AADDS admin. And remember what I said earlier about having to reset the password? You'll actually have to reset the password after the AADDS is finished provisioning for this to actually work. So make sure you do that. I've already done this, so I'll just enter my new password in here. And these other three passwords are just passwords that you can choose for various resources and VMs on the deployment. So I'll just set these quickly. The PCOIP registration code you can receive from our sales team. I have a copy that I can use here, so I'll just enter mine in. So there's 4 more IDs here that are related to the authentication of the deployment itself, and some of them are related to what's called the service principal. So for the service principal, there's detailed documentation on how to create one, but so you can click here and create a new service principal, but I already created one because it's a bit of a time-consuming process, although the docs highlight it pretty well and it should be pretty simple. But from the service principal, there's a few IDs that you need. So you need this client ID, which will be application client ID. You need the object ID, which will go to the object ID. And you need the client secret. So this client secret is actually only shown once when you create the secret. If you forget it, you can just create a new one, but I still have mine saved, so I'll just enter mine quickly. And finally, there's a tenant ID, which you can just find under the Azure Active Directory here. Oops. So that should be all the variables set up, and if we init and begin the deployment again, just like we did with the AADDS. Oops, forgot the flag. Just like with the AADDS, it does some checks, then it should be ready to go and it should begin deploying. So once the deployment starts, it'll once again take around 30 to 40 minutes. So once again, I'll just stop the video here and see you then when it finishes. Alright, I'm back and it looks like everything's finished provisioning successfully. So I'll just go into the resource group with a single connector and you can see all the resources are here. So that about wraps it up for the demo part that I wanted to go over. The workstation should be fully deployed now and ready to be configured for actual PC over IP connections. So for steps on how to do this and how to assign users to connections, you can refer to the documentation, which covers it in a good amount of detail. But going back to the presentation itself, there's one last thing I wanted to cover. So right now, all the current demos and instructions have assumed that the AADDS doesn't exist on the tenant. Since the AADDS is unique per tenant, it might be the case that the Azure AD tenant that you want to deploy workstations from already has an AADDS configuration on it. So that means you can't deploy it from scratch and set up all the rules automatically through Terraform. So in this section, I just wanted to go over a few rules that you need to set up in order to get the AADDS to play nicely with the workstation deployments. So the first set of rules are the NSG rules. You need to set up these following rules to allow communication from these IPs. So you'll need wide open VNet connections. You'll need port 5985 and port 22 opened. This IP address will be the IP address of the machine that you're deploying from. And lastly, you'll need port 5986 open to the Azure Active Directory domain services. So this is just a service tag. The AADDS needs this to actually function, so make sure you don't forget this rule. The next configuration you need to go over is the PFX certificate for the secure LDAPs communications. So to check this, you need to go to the actual AADDS resource and click on secure LDAP and make sure that these two options are enabled. So if they aren't, you'll also need to set up a certificate, and I'll just go over a quick demo on how to do that. So here I have PowerShell opened in the AADDS deployment directory from the GitHub repo. And if you look, there's a script called generatepfx.ps1 here. This script is all you need to run to generate the PFX file necessary, so just run it. Another thing is you'll need to open it in administrator mode, so just make sure you do so or else the script won't work. The first argument to the script will be the password, so this is just going to be any password. And the second argument will be the domain name of the AADDS, so make sure those are matching. And after I run it, there's a cert.pfx generated, and you can see there's now a cert.pfx in here. And to upload it to Azure, you go to the resource group of the AADDS, go to the AADS resource, secure LDAP, change certificate, and select the file cert.pfx. And password will be whatever you set there. The last thing you need to set up is the AADDS DNS servers. You'll need to make sure it's custom and points at 2 IP addresses. It doesn't actually matter what these IP addresses are, as long as they're there. The Terraform deployment will be able to detect the actual IP addresses themselves. So to do that, you just go to the VNet of the AADDS and go to DNS servers and just make sure it's on custom with these IP addresses configured, not on default. So that about wraps up the presentation. It's about everything I want to present. Thank you for listening, and hopefully now you have a better idea on how to create a workstation deployment for the AADDS.